Oh, hello again, and welcome back. I've got a very exciting topic prepared for you today. Today we're going to talk about Luciferic grace, or the Luciferic graceful type. This is the aberrant type of every chosen Hyperborean initiate. It describes the ethical attitude which is present for the lost Virya in front of the sacred symbol. When the ego is confronted by the sacred symbol, it will respond with one of three behaviors or attitudes. But before describing them, I need to clarify what this phenomenon is, what it means, what are these terms? Sacred symbol, aberrant type. Aberrant type just means unique type. What is a sacred symbol? A sacred symbol is a symbol which expresses a particular archetype. Nimrod describes this phenomenon as the fundamental ethical act, where interiorly, on the light sphere, or the astral plane, the ego is forcefully impressioned by a sacred symbol. What's the sacred symbol exactly? Nimrod gives a few examples of what the sacred symbol would be. He describes a Catholic being impressioned by the bleeding heart crowned with thorns, or symbols like a circle, a cross, a heart, or a serpent. Nimrod further distinguishes this act by its unique capacity to perplex the lost ego. He states it is not possible for the lost ego to react indifferently to this phenomenon. There are only three possible reactions to this perplexing phenomenon, which demonstrate the attitude of the conscious subject, or Virya. Nimrod describes these attitudes as the ludic attitude, the sacralizing attitude, and the Luciferic graceful attitude. For today, I will only be covering the Luciferic graceful attitude. But these three attitudes or reactions to an emerging sacred symbol are best described allegorically, and Nimrod de Rosario does this in the allegory known as Mr. Aberro and the balloon, or might be a rolled R, which I can't do very well, Mr. Aberro and the balloon. So, without further ado, the allegory of Mr. Aberro and the balloon. Within the allegory, we must distinguish two moments, characterized by different acts or icons. First, we will describe one act and establish some analogical correspondences. Finally, we will observe the second act and draw definitive conclusions. With things thus arranged, we can move on to the first act. In it, we see a room full of regular dimensions occupied by Mr. Aberro, who is the owner of a pressurized cylinder full of a very valuable gas mixture, which practically constitutes his entire wealth. He does not wish, therefore, to lose the gas for anything in the world, and that is why he periodically watches the vent valve, making sure that it is well closed. Here is the reason for the surprise. This time, upon looking at the valve, he sees that it is open and that, above the cylinder, the heteromorphic figure of a polychromatic balloon is inflating without ceasing. Faced with the appearance of the balloon, Mr. Aberro notices simultaneously several things: that his valuable gas constantly feeds the balloon's swelling, that the polychromatism of its changing surface is very attractive to him, that, however, he admires its metamorphosis much more because, although it grows continuously, it never ends up taking a definitive form, etc. And, faced with an impression of such varied and even contradictory shades, Mr. Aberro stops perplexed for a long instant, observing that the pneumatic orb is, or has become, extremely large. It will not be difficult to establish the analogous points of so simple an allegorical image. Thus, Mr. Aberro represents the ego of the lost Virya, perplexed in front of the appearance of the sacred symbol. The cylinder is equivalent to a deposit of unconscious psychic energy and the gas mixture to said energy, and the valve corresponds to the organ or function by means of which the will of the ego manifests itself on the phenomenon. It is evident then that the balloon is a figure analogous to the sacred symbol. If we look closely, we will see that the balloon, with its continuous growth, shows itself to be very similar to the process of the sacred symbol. The balloon, like the symbol, at the beginning of the phenomenon is only a germ, full of potential properties. The open valve allows the blowing of the gases to nourish the germ and develop its potency, actualizing all those forms seen by Mr. Aberro, that are nothing more than moments of a phenomenon, states or phases of the process. The sacred symbol, too, like the balloon, is, at the beginning of the phenomenon, only a germ, i.e., a pure potential sign, the nourishing inflow of the unconscious psychic energy, which is made up by archetypes, like the mixture by gases, produces the development of the germ symbol, the properties of which are actualized in the consciousness. Let us at no time forget that the process that we are studying, the appearance of the sacred symbol, is that by which a symbol becomes conscious and can be known. Every relationship between the ego and a symbol reveals a degree of conscious knowledge, whether the ego takes on the symbol with understanding or whether the symbol stands inflated and threatening in front of a powerless ego. In the first act, it is the inflation of the balloon, the dynamic subject that acts objectively on Mr. Aberro, who, on the contrary, remains passive, perplexed, in front of the phenomenon. The second act makes a record of Mr. Aberro's possible reactions that analogically correspond to the psychological types. In summary, the first act showed the action of the sacred symbol on the lost ego, i.e., the constitution of the fundamental ethical act. The second will show the reaction of the lost ego, a reaction that should be interpreted as the fundamental ethical attitude of the ego in front of the sacred symbol, and that defines the psychological type of the lost Virya by his ludic, sacralizing, or Luciferic graceful attitude. For the sake of clarity, it is convenient to separate the description of the three typic attitudes and present them one at a time. The second act comes, then, divided into three scenes: 1, 2, and 3. D. The analogical description of ludic, sacralizing, and Luciferic graceful attitudes. 1. Ludic attitude. While his perplexity was dissipating, Mr. Aberro's soul was torn between two conflicting sentiments: fascination and attraction for the polychromatic balloon, and fear of its growth process. From such a conflict, the latter was triumphant, and soon Mr. Aberro was dominated by a more intense fear, which replaced his perplexity and was threatening to convert itself into panic. And Mr. Aberro's reaction was swift and typical, giving no time for the balloon to expand too much. He fled. But before fleeing, he abruptly swiped his hand and snatched the balloon from the nozzle of the cylinder, taking it with him to the corner of the room in which he had taken refuge. For Mr. Aberro, the balloon thus transformed into a toy. Of course, that which he had in his hands was nothing at all like the balloon that had previously expanded over the cylinder, and fascinated him with its polychromatic beauty. Not after the gas escaped from its interior and transformed into a deflated membrane. Excuse me. Not after the gas escaped from its interior and transformed into a deflated membrane. The balloon, at the onset of the phenomenon, was a germ, a polymorphous potency of which would unfold under pressure of the gases. Without gas, the balloon would be only a husk of a germ, and while Mr. Aberro was playing with that cadaver, the valve on the cylinder was still open, and the precious gas that had been feeding the balloon was vented out. 2. Sacralizing attitude. The appearance of the balloon made a strong impression on Mr. Aberro. At first he felt as if shocked, frozen with astonishment, and finally amazed. After a succession of similar states, Mr. Aberro experienced the conviction that he was in front of a numinous manifestation, a supernatural fact, a sign of a divine presence or divinity itself. In place of perplexity, his ego adopted an attitude of ecstatic contemplation of the phenomenon, i.e., to the initial uncertainty he added an even greater passivity. But in this becoming, the balloon was still growing continuously. That is to say, the phenomenon had stabilized. And when the balloon was sufficiently large, to Mr. Aberro's fearful and prudent assessment, he took for granted that which was so large and beautiful must necessarily be superior. And feeling his soul diminished in the face of so much grandeur, shrunken with religious fervor, annihilated by a nameless devotion, Mr. Aberro performed his first action since witnessing the phenomenon. He knelt down and worshipped the colorful balloon. And the balloon, which continued growing with stability, was so enormous that it ended up occupying the entire space of the room, adapting itself to the form of the things that were there, which became embedded in different parts of the elastic surface. And so it occurred that the balloon ended up encompassing Mr. Aberro, who was still in his devoted position, absorbing him between its voluble curves and burying him in the depths of its strange pneumatics. 3. Luciferic graceful attitude. The appearance of the balloon shook Mr. Aberro's soul like a whiplash, and immediately the phenomenon impressioned him in its quality of dramatic fact, full of inevitable meaning. Perplexity was abandoned in the face of the intimate conviction that he must act. But such an action on the phenomenon was foreseen from the beginning as fatally tragic, and that is why Mr. Aberro smiled to give himself courage. Mr. Aberro, who was attentively observing the phenomenon, adopted the attitude of smiling at the moment of acting, and at that very moment the miracle took place. His laughter changed the meaning of the event, transforming it from dramatic into comic. Thereupon, Mr. Aberro reached out and closed the valve, thus preventing the gas from passing through. The balloon was fixed at a point in its inflation and was thus kept by Mr. Aberro, who, after inspecting and apprehending it, added it to his collection of pneumatic, utilitarian, didactic, and humorous objects. That was the allegory of Mr. Aberro and the balloon. What's interesting is there are two translations of the fundamentals of the Hyperborean wisdom. Originally, it was printed in Spanish and then later translated into English. The first English translation was a digital translation, and the literal wording for some of the phrases, which included Luciferic grace, were actually Luciferic funny type. And I think this gives a clue as well that helps to explain what the attitude actually means. I wrote some additional notes I'll cover real quick before closing this video. The valor of Luciferic grace is nuanced, an interior quality not external. It is the resisting of psychic phagocytation by the sacred symbol. Page 852, he describes it as well. Let's see. In synthesis, the Luciferic graceful attitude breaks the balloon law, confirming the sentence that enunciates, "To break the laws of the universe is the essence of the Luciferic." Everyone knows, for example, that a joke told at the right moment can defuse any dramatic situation, and that which describes the heroes, before protagonizing a feat, bidding farewell with a joke, a jest, is a scene repeated in all cultures with very few variations. He will not fear. He will instead exhibit a Luciferic graceful attitude that will enable him to overcome the perplexity before the big one. Where was it? Valor. And this Gnostic attitude, purely spiritual, valorous to the point of recklessness, which laughs at danger and takes what suits it without asking anyone's permission, is, needless to insist on it, truly Luciferic. I will refrain, for now, on elaborating on my interpretation, my personal interpretation, because, as I've stated, it runs the risk of confusing or disorienting people. But for now, I will conclude there and elaborate further in the future. Thank you once again for joining me, and stay tuned.